Society, scientific and unscientific. Scientific views and unscientific from the point of view of science and official science. When an experiment becomes the basis of science, even when it is made public and all the information is available, how can the average person verify it? Well, the only thing is that one knows, and being able to perform it and thereby confirm it, or having an unsuspected or blatant source of verification. When the basis is logic, however, ability, motive, knowledge and effort are required, but it is still much easier to verify. If one person doesn't know, someone else will. But when public debate about real and other scientific facts is not allowed, science is censored and its devaluation occurs. But the masses know very little about science. It should be noted, regardless of the obviousness of the above, that this does not necessarily mean that its value is diminished in the eyes of the masses. Then, on the contrary, for everything that is said to be scientific but unfortunately unverifiable, the majority begins to accept it as religious dogma. Therefore, the devalued scientific facts value in the eyes of the masses increases drastically, which represents an overestimated value that is, of course, unrealistic. This leads to an essentially completely wrong attitude towards the informational content. Thus, a hidden inflation or a substantial loss of its true value is imperceptibly created for the masses, which the whole society would inevitably have to pay, but the burden of payment is shifted to those who know the least about it and who have to work hard to survive. From this, it is obvious that the burden of payment is being shifted to the masses who do the actual work. In this way, it can be understood that any activity that can lead to large earnings is not real work or useful work for society. From the social needs point of view, it leads to the understanding of work activities as desirable and undesirable. Desirable is everything that respects and protects the law, but nevertheless that which changes the laws not being in accordance with social interests, such as abolishing the wrong and establishing the right ones. Still, true definition of social interest is somehow omitted, if not blurred and underestimated. In order to achieve the desired social work, an organization is needed, which is impossible without unity. Since ancient times, therefore, the very basis of governance has been divide and rule. In order to most effectively divide the people, it is necessary to estrange them. The more grounds for strife, the greater the mess. The greater the disorder, the more order is needed. Essentially is naturally correct, and people should pay for establishing, maintenance and legal order betterment. Unfortunately, a large part of the additional funds goes to the creation of disorder in order to direct more funds to additional regulation of the disorder. Practically, the real value that enables the aforementioned funds needed for financing gets practically allocated from the results of the masses' labor and service engagement. There is nothing wrong with all of this if it is guided by the proper measure. Long ago, Kant said that the most important criterion in everything is the right measure of things. Regardless of the countless citations of that famous saying, how tragically it gets interpreted throughout history. The big question remains undefined. Who, in person, is the reference system's basic factor determining the mentioned correctness echelon basic measure? When the regulation of disorder is mentioned, it should be understood that it does not mean only the introduction of order, taken for the abolition of disorder, but the literal regulation of disorder itself. It's so obvious and literal, but most people don't see it, even though it's right in front of their eyes. The reason is that subconsciously it is unbelievable to them that there is even possibility of doing something so incorrect and so obvious, and that it gets going on unnoticed. Thus, in connection with the so-called disorder regulation, there are organized activities even in the sense of how much and what kind of disorder might be needed to justify such in purposes' huge budget allocations for Establishing legal order, in the multiple meanings of the term, requires leaders, structures, contractors, and funding. When leaders come from the people, it means that they have a lot of popular support. Consequently, they are taken for natural leaders. However, generally they lack a knowledge and connections to create necessary goals. Realization teams, while ensuring successful political cooperation and negotiating positions with holders in power. Like everything else, that process also has its costs, which inevitably have to be covered financially. In such crisis situations, as history has repeatedly proven, leaders are imposed on the people through organized infiltration, where masses are being led where these leaders lead them and not where their real need is. As if bewitched, the individuals follow the leader, only to be completely confused at the moment when they come to their senses, not knowing where they have been led in relation to the initial promises that were blindly believed. That is why the notion of the human herd and the concept of its shepherds was born. It should be noted that there is a difference between a tame herd and a wild herd of wild boars, a pack of horses or dogs, etc. Because of the basic polarity and finance itself, created systematically as a concept of economic domination as convenient as possible, it arises in two ways. The justified way is based on the real value created by the work invested. The other part is value that is created by speculation and has no basis in actual socially justified service. However, since costs must be paid, and for this, a counter value has been established, being in the form of cash and non-cash means of payment. Money can and should have a real basis of exchange value based on a clear, transparent, realistic, and verifiable value. But that implies an exchange between equals. This world is not based on equality, although it is more talked about than practiced. One of the priority goals of today's humanity is the understanding and application of the equality principle, along with the establishment of a just and therefore correct legislative, judicial, executive reign. By all means, including money, it is necessary to do things right in a socially positive way, as well as legally, or simply put, positively or benevolently manipulated. The problem is when negative manipulation gets involved, being very complex, cunning, legally undefined, hidden or separated from legal responsibility. The above represents the basics of understanding that any money or mean of payment should be equivalent or counter-equivalent to a real value. Otherwise, any money that is not based on those principles is basically speculative, thus opening up more and more space for negative manipulation that occurs through payment mechanisms. When the counter value is insufficient, claims arise in relation to the real difference. When the requesting party, for example, on an international scale, cannot achieve this, extraordinary grounds are being created for the creation of the aforementioned disturbances that can reach the proportions of war. The issues of the understanding of war, its origins, goals, and ways of conducting it are the subject of an extremely extensive study. First of all the cultures and structures of the leading power holders, both in determining positions and capacities, ways of carrying out and achieving goals. It is clear from the above that the only real basis of value is socially beneficial work, and that thereby all the burden of payment is transferred to those who do the most socially appropriate work. It is clear that it is necessary to provide compensation to all participants in socially valuable work. This should also be in complete agreement with the impartial judicial, health, security, and military police systems, which should then successfully, through politics, regulate the economy in the broadest social interest. Within numerous structures, the seemingly very logical setting, "If I don't take it, someone else will," has been successfully implemented into the subconscious. This proves to be practical and very logically correct for a society which, from a socio-legal point of view, is defined as predatory. It remains for the inhabitants to ask themselves whether they want to live in the jungle, from which civilized man has been making efforts to separate himself since ancient times. Or, albeit unconsciously, that with their negligence, laziness, greed and unscrupulousness, they indirectly allow the continuation and change of the once predatory jungle of vegetation into modern predatory slavery in the form of a concrete, asphalt and metal glass unnatural curse without enough greenery, healthy air, water and food.